I want to talk to you about a wonderful series of books on ear training by Professor Elvo S. This is the set right here, and there's 3 volumes. Volume 1 is about hearing scales and modes. He calls it Tetrachords, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. Volume 2 is hearing the basic interval sounds. So he teaches you how to hear a major third, minor third, sixth, minor sixth, major 7 octave, etc. And volume 3 is about combining those into chords and being able to hear, understand, hear a chord and understand what notes are in that chord. So I studied with Elvo in the early 1980s and took a lot of classes from him. They were junior college classes. And they really changed my life. They really made me hear music in a totally different way. They also made me a little bit more serious and precise about music and describing it, in writing it down, in saying what it was. And I'll always be indebted to Professor DeMonte for that. This book kind of reflects the way he teaches, this series of books rather. When he retired, he put these together, and I did the recordings for the books. So the exercises are all either on CD or downloadable. Let me tell you a little bit about each one of these books. So Tetrachords, it's kind of an odd concept if you haven't heard it before. It has nothing to do with actual chords, playing chords, let's say. But what it is a tetrachord is a series of 4 tones. And what Professor DeMonte does in this book is he breaks down every scale, major, minor, chromatic, every mode, whether it's Dorian or Phrygian or Mixolydian or whatever, into what tetrachords make them up. So tetrachord number 1 is Do, Re, Mi, Fa. And tetrachord number 1 is defined by the intervals between those notes. So Do, Re, whole step, Re, Mi, whole step, and then half step. So it's half step, a whole step, half step. And you put 2 number 1 tetrachords together with a whole step in between them, ascending, and you get a major scale. To get a minor scale, you have tetrachord number 2, and tetrachord number 2 would be, if I remember right, I'm going to look it up in the book, whole step, half step, whole step. So when you go through, you learn these several tetrachords, and you're able to hear them in scales and modes, and construct the scales and modes from these building blocks. So that's volume number 1. Volume number 2 is the one that I really, really got a lot out of and I really enjoyed. And what Professor DeMonte would do is he would talk about in class, he'd say, okay, this is what this interval sounds like. And he'd play it on the piano. And he'd play it at different spots in the piano. He'd have us sing it. And then what we were supposed to do before the next class was to go to the library and make a copy of his specially recorded exercises for that class, which would drill us on the intervals that we worked on in class that day. So I'd drive around the San Francisco Bay Area with this in my cassette player and singing all these intervals as we went along. And it really worked. And I had mentioned that Elvo was the best teacher I ever had. And one of the reasons was he really held your feet to the fire in a really nice way. He was a very kind, gentle, funny guy. And you had to go in and sing for him every few weeks, go into his office and sing. And so he'd go over whatever we had not gone over before, and he'd say, okay, what's this interval? And he'd play on the piano. And if you got it wrong, he'd say, you better come back and see me again next week. You need to work on your minor sixth. But it made you learn it, and you knew you were going to have to face him again next week. And he was always very nice about it, but he was very serious that you really needed to learn this stuff in order to progress. So anyway, the way he teaches these exercises would be, let's say the first class would be learning bum, bum, perfect fourth, and the other interval you'd get, or maybe he taught 3, I can't remember. He'd give you the octave, and he might give you major sixth. My wild, like my wild Irish rose. And so the exercises, you knew it was going to be one of those 3. So you had a pretty good chance of getting it right. And the way he taught it too is that in the early classes, you learned the most different intervals. So it's pretty easy to hear the difference between, say, an octave and a major third. So the next class, you'd get the next 2 or 3 intervals, whatever they were. And the exercise would be first learning those, and then he'd put them together with the ones you previously learned. So now you might have 4 or 5 intervals to choose from. And so gradually you'd really get the feeling for which were which. And if you had trouble with one or another of these intervals, you could work on those and really start hearing these things. And I was just amazed at what I started hearing after a little bit of work and after a few weeks. So eventually, toward the end of the class, you have all of your intervals that it can be one of, could be major 7, it could be octave, it could be third, it could be second, it could be minor second. Anyway, all of those. And so you really got to hear the difference between them. And that's the way the class went. That's the way this volume works. And the other volumes work the same way with this kind of drills and exercises to keep this flowing through your head, through your ears, and have you hear it. So once you've got the intervals, then volume 3 is in constructing those intervals and assembling them into chords. Now, the way he teaches this is kind of, I thought it was a really revolutionary way to do it, is he teaches you all the chords that have D in the bass. So the D could be the root, it could be the third, it could be the 5th, it could be the 7th, major 7 or dominant 7. And all those chords, when I had studied chords before, I kind of almost always studied chords with the root and the bass. And that's great to do, but he got me out of that and got me to being able to hear, chords that didn't have the root and the bass. And that's how this works. It's set up the same way with the drills, where he'll teach you, probably, I think he started on the D chords, and that was with the root and the bass. And then he taught you other ones with the third and the bass and so on. But he combined the most different ones, 2 or 3 of the most different ones in the first exercise. So you kind of had a fighting chance of identifying these things. So anyway, here it is. It's the 3-volume set. Starts with tetrachords, then hearing intervals, and then with hearing chords. And this is just really an amazing thing. You do have to do a lot of work. You do have to practice. It's not something that you can just read and get. It's something that you just have to go through the exercises. But it is like a class that you would take in junior college or college. But man, it really turned my head around. And I'm so glad that I got a chance to work with Professor DeMonte those years ago and to produce these books. And I'm so happy to be able to keep bringing them to people that are interested in it. So check it out on my website, www.musicsnow.com. Ear training.